The orbital station of Leratus drifted in the quiet brilliance of a blue-white star, its vast ringed structure turning slowly, like a patient clock measuring time in rotations instead of seconds. From a distance it resembled a jewel threaded with lines of light, but inside it was noise, color, and motion. Thousands of travelers crossing paths, traders arguing over prices, musicians performing in corridors where sound carried in strange, beautiful ways through the carefully tuned air currents. Colin stepped off the docking tram with a small travel case slung over his shoulder and paused for a moment, simply watching the crowd. He had spent the last 3 months moving cargo between systems where the stars were dim and the stations were quiet, the kind of places where conversations rarely lasted longer than a fuel transaction. Leratus felt alive in comparison, and he allowed himself a slow breath, as if inhaling the energy of the place. A floating sign drifted past, projecting soft golden letters into the air. Cultural Convergence Festival. All species welcome. Beneath the message, animated figures of different alien forms danced in looping patterns. Colin chuckled quietly. All species welcome, he muttered. That usually means at least 3 foods I can't pronounce, and one that tries to pronounce me. Still, curiosity tugged at him, and curiosity had always been one of his more profitable instincts. He followed the flow of people toward the central promenade, where the festival had transformed the station's largest plaza into something almost dreamlike. Gravity in the plaza had been adjusted to a slightly lower setting, allowing drifting lanterns to hover overhead, their lights shimmering in colors that shifted like oil on water. Platforms of transparent crystal floated at different heights, each hosting performers from different worlds. One group played instruments that hummed rather than sang, vibrating the air so gently that Colin felt the music in his chest more than he heard it. Another group danced in slow spirals, their garments trailing luminous threads that hung in the air for seconds before fading. Colin wandered through it all with an easy smile, occasionally stopping to sample unfamiliar foods or watch a performance. At one stall, a vendor offered him a translucent cube that tasted simultaneously like citrus and warm bread, which he decided was either genius or deeply suspicious. At another, a mechanical poet recited verses about asteroid mining to a completely indifferent audience, pausing every few lines to ask for tips. By the time he reached the center of the plaza, the music had changed again. A wide circle had formed where dancers moved together in patterns guided by subtle pulses of light projected onto the floor. The rhythm was gentle but steady, easy to follow even for those with 2 left feet, or in Colin's case, 2 reasonably coordinated feet that occasionally forgot which one was supposed to lead. He stood at the edge of the circle watching, half tempted to join and half content to remain an observer. That was when he became aware of someone standing beside him. "I think," said a calm, warm voice, "that the trick is not to think too much about the steps." Colin turned. The woman beside him looked, at first glance, entirely human. She was tall, her posture relaxed yet graceful, her expression thoughtful but bright with quiet amusement. Only after a moment did he notice the difference. Her ears were long, elegant, tapering to gentle points that curved slightly backward, giving her an appearance both striking and subtly otherworldly. "I wasn't thinking about the steps," Colin said. "I was thinking about how embarrassed I'll be when I miss them." She laughed softly. "Then you are already thinking too much." "That's a fair accusation," he admitted. "Happens to me all the time." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the dancers turn and glide. "Would you like to try?" she asked. Colin blinked. "You're asking me?" "I am." "Well," he said, adjusting the strap on his case and setting it aside, "I suppose there are worse ways to injure my pride." Her laughter came easily, and there was something disarming about it, not forced, not polite, but genuine, as though she truly enjoyed the absurdity of things. They stepped into the circle. At first, Colin concentrated carefully on the rhythm, but the steps were simple, and the music carried them forward with an almost effortless flow. The lighting shifted in slow waves, and the hum of instruments blended with the murmur of voices and distant applause from other performances. Before long, he realized he was no longer thinking about his feet at all. "I'm Colin," he said as they turned. "Elara," she replied. "Are you visiting the station?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And for an instant, something in her expression suggested the answer was more complicated than it sounded. Then she smiled again. "And you?" "Passing through," Colin said. "Trader, mostly harmless." "Mostly?" "Well, there was that incident with the spice shipment on Torvain, but in my defense, no one told me the containers were alive." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Alive?" "They were very small," Colin said, "and extremely offended by temperature changes." Elara laughed again, and the sound blended with the music in a way that made Colin feel unexpectedly light, as if the months of solitary travel had loosened their grip on him all at once. They moved from one dance to another, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply enjoying the motion and the music. Time slipped by in a way that felt almost unreal, measured not in minutes but in songs. At one point they stepped aside to drink from a fountain that dispensed chilled, lightly sparkling water infused with faint floral notes. "I had forgotten," Elara said quietly, looking out over the plaza, "how alive places like this can feel." "You don't get to festivals often?" Colin asked. "Not as often as I would like." "That's a shame. Everyone should get to stand in a crowd where no one expects anything from them." She glanced at him, and for a moment her expression softened in a way that suggested his words had struck deeper than he intended. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." They returned to the dancing, and the hours continued to pass, unnoticed and uncounted. Colin found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in years, small, ridiculous memories of travel mishaps and strange encounters. Elara listened with genuine interest, sometimes asking questions, sometimes offering observations that were unexpectedly perceptive and occasionally mischievously funny. At one point, watching a group of acrobats perform in low gravity, Colin shook his head. "I tried that once," he said, "ended up drifting into a ventilation duct. And? And I learned that ventilation ducts are much narrower than they appear when you are floating toward them face first." Elara covered her mouth, laughing. The music softened as another set of performers took the stage and the lighting dimmed slightly, casting the plaza in a warm, golden glow. Around them the crowd thinned a little, but the atmosphere remained alive, vibrant, filled with quiet joy. Colin became aware gradually that he had not thought about his cargo, his schedule, or the endless calculations of trade routes for hours. The realization surprised him. It was rare in his life to forget the weight of practical concerns. "I'm glad I came tonight," he said. "So am I," Elara replied. For a moment they stood side by side, watching the dancers, the drifting lanterns reflected in the curved glass of the dome far above, beyond which the stars shone in silent brilliance. Somewhere in the distance a bell chimed softly, marking the passing of another hour, though neither of them paid it any attention. The music shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, from a slow rhythmic pulse into something lighter, quicker, carried by instruments that seemed to chime rather than play. Colin noticed it first through the movement of the dancers around him. The steps became faster, more playful, and the glowing patterns on the floor adjusted to guide them. Elara tilted her head slightly, listening. "This style comes from the inner Karathi world," she said. "It's meant to feel like moving through wind." "That explains why I feel like I'm about to be blown over," Colin replied, narrowly avoiding stepping on his own heel. "If I start spinning uncontrollably, please tell everyone it's part of the tradition." "I might," she said, eyes bright with amusement, "but only if you look dignified while doing it." "I never look dignified," Colin said. "I once tripped over a cargo drone in front of an entire customs council. They wrote it into their official records. I hope they at least described it poetically." "They did." The human merchant demonstrated an unexpected interaction with automated equipment. Elara laughed, the sound light and unrestrained, and they continued moving with the dancers, gradually finding the rhythm together again. The air in the plaza carried the faint scent of spiced vapor from nearby food stalls, mixed with the cool metallic undertone of the station's life support systems. Above them, the great transparent dome revealed a drifting field of distant stars, their lights softened by the station's shielding. They danced through two more songs and then another, pausing only briefly to rest at the edge of the circle. Around them, performers rotated in and out of the central platforms, each bringing a different mood. A group of small, round-bodied musicians floated in a cluster, tapping softly on suspended crystal orbs that glowed with each touch, producing tones that shimmered like ripples in water. Colin leaned back against a railing, catching his breath. I think I've used muscles I didn't know I had. That is the purpose of dancing, Elara said. To remind you that you are alive in ways that sitting never does. I sit professionally, Colin said. It's a critical part of trading. Sitting in negotiations, sitting in cockpits, sitting while waiting for inspectors who are almost finished for 3 hours. That sounds exhausting. It is, especially the inspectors. They shared a quiet smile, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The hum of conversation and music filled the space between them, comfortable rather than awkward. So, Colin said after a while, what do you do when you're not attending festivals and rescuing strangers from standing awkwardly at the edge of dance floors? Elara considered the question, her gaze drifting toward the distant performers. I spend much of my time listening, she said at last, and deciding, sometimes advising, sometimes being advised. It depends on the day. That sounds important, Colin said. It can be, she replied simply. He sensed there was more behind her words, but her tone carried a gentle boundary, and he respected it. Traders learned quickly when to press and when to let silence breathe. A procession of performers passed nearby, their garments trailing faint trails of bioluminescent dust that faded moments after they moved. One of them stumbled slightly in the low gravity, bumping into a tall, insect-like spectator who responded by producing a series of clicking sounds that might have been laughter. The sight made Colin grin. I love festivals, he said. Every species trying to look elegant at the same time. Statistically, someone is always about to fall over. Do you always look for statistical humor? Elara asked. Only when I'm tired or hungry. It's a coping mechanism. Does it work? Rarely, but it annoys people into laughing, which is almost the same thing. They returned to the dance floor as a new melody began, slower again, carried by long, resonant notes that seemed to vibrate through the floor itself. The lighting dimmed slightly, shifting into deeper hues of gold and violet, and the crowd moved closer together, the rhythm guiding them in gentle, circular patterns. Colin found himself relaxing into the motion, no longer thinking about steps or timing. Elara moved with a natural grace that made it easy to follow, and there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself, as though she were accustomed to being observed yet chose, in this moment, not to notice. You dance well, she said after a while. I suspect you're being polite. I am being honest. Well, Colin said, in that case, I will treasure this moment forever and remind myself of it whenever someone tells me I have the coordination of a cargo crate. They both laughed softly. Time continued to slip by, measured only by the changing music and the gradual thinning of the crowd as some festival goers drifted away to other parts of the station. Yet the plaza never felt empty. New visitors arrived, drawn by the sound and light, and the energy of the place remained steady, like the slow, endless turning of the station itself. At one point, they stepped aside again, this time to watch a performance on a nearby platform where two dancers manipulated fields of controlled gravity, rising and falling in slow arcs that looked almost like flight. The audience watched in hushed fascination as the performers spiraled around each other, their movements perfectly synchronized. It's beautiful, Colin said quietly. Yes, Elara agreed. It is. He glanced at her, noticing the way her eyes reflected the shifting lights, and for a moment he had the strange, fleeting sense that she was not merely watching the performance, but absorbing it, as though storing the memory with unusual care. You look like you're memorizing every second, he said. Perhaps I am, she replied softly. They stood in silence for a while longer, and then, almost without speaking, they found themselves returning to the dance floor once more. The hours passed in a gentle blur of music, laughter, and conversation. Colin told her about a pilot he once knew who insisted on naming every asteroid they passed, even when the names were things like definitely not a rock and rock 2. Elara responded with a story about a formal ceremony that had gone disastrously wrong when a translator drone began replacing every third word with the phrase ceremonial cabbage, a memory that made her laugh so hard she had to pause to catch her breath. Eventually, Colin became aware of the subtle shift in the atmosphere that comes when night deepens, even on a station where artificial lighting masked the passage of time. The crowd was smaller now, the music softer, the lanterns glowing with a warmer light. "I should probably sleep at some point," he said reluctantly. "My ship leaves in 2 days, and I still have cargo to inspect." "Of course," Elara said, though there was a faint note of regret in her voice. They drifted toward the edge of the plaza, neither in a hurry to leave. The great dome above them revealed the slow movement of distant stars, and somewhere far below, the faint vibration of docking engines thrummed through the station's structure. "I'm glad you asked me to dance," Colin said. "I'm glad you said yes," she replied. For a moment they stood facing each other, the sounds of the festival continuing softly around them. And Colin had the quiet, unexpected feeling that this night, ordinary in so many ways, was somehow more important than he yet understood. They might have parted then, politely, like two strangers who had shared a pleasant evening and nothing more. Colin even picked up his travel case and slung it over his shoulder, already imagining the quiet corridor that led back to his rented cabin. But neither of them moved. The music had softened again, shifting into a slower rhythm carried by low, resonant tones that seemed to echo faintly in the metal bones of the station. A handful of dancers still moved across the glowing floor, their shadows stretching and bending in the warm light. "One more?" Elara asked. Colin looked at the circle, then back at her. "If I collapse, I'm blaming you." "That seems fair." They stepped back into the light. This dance was different, slower and more deliberate. The steps were simple, almost meditative, and the music carried a quiet weight that made conversation unnecessary. Around them, the remaining festival goers moved in unhurried patterns, and for a time Colin found himself simply listening to the music, to the distant murmur of voices, to the faint hum of the station itself. He became aware gradually of how relaxed he felt. It was a rare sensation, like setting down a heavy pack he had forgotten he was carrying. "You travel alone?" Elara asked softly as they turned. "Most of the time," he said. "It's easier that way. No arguments about routes, no debates about who forgot to refuel." "That sounds lonely." "It can be," he admitted, "but you get used to it. Traders are good at getting used to things. Unexpected tariffs, broken engines, restaurants that serve food capable of dissolving cutlery." "That last one sounds particularly dangerous." "I still have a scar on my favorite spoon." She laughed quietly, and the sound seemed to linger in the air, as gentle as the music. "And you?" Colin asked. "Do you travel alone?" Elara hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Not usually," she said. Before he could ask more, a sudden movement at the edge of the plaza drew his attention. A group of figures had entered from one of the upper walkways, moving quickly but with careful precision. They wore formal garments of deep blue and silver, their postures straight, their expressions focused. Even from a distance, there was something unmistakably official about them. Colin followed their path with mild curiosity, assuming they were searching for a lost dignitary or a late performer. Festivals attracted all kinds of important visitors. The music continued, the dancers moved, and for a moment nothing seemed unusual. Then one of the figures spotted Elara. The change was subtle but immediate. The group altered course, approaching with quiet urgency. Their steps were controlled, their voices low but firm as they spoke to nearby spectators, who stepped aside instinctively. Colin felt a faint, inexplicable tension settle in his chest. "Elara," he said quietly. She had seen them too. For the first time since he had met her, her expression shifted. Not into fear, but into something like resignation, mixed with faint amusement, as if she had known this moment would come sooner or later. "I suppose," she said softly, "that I have been found." "Found?" The attendants reached them then, stopping a respectful distance away. One of them, a tall Kyrathi man with silver threads woven into his dark uniform, bowed his head slightly. "Your Majesty," he said. The words seemed to echo in Colin's mind, refusing to settle into any sensible shape. "Your Majesty," he blinked, certain he had misheard. "I believe," Elara said calmly, "that I asked for a few hours." "You have had 6, Your Majesty," the attendant replied gently. "The council is waiting, and the ambassadorial delegation has arrived earlier than expected. Colin stood very still. Your Majesty. The pieces began to shift in his mind. The way she spoke, the quiet confidence in her posture, the attendants who had said she did not travel alone. The realization unfolded slowly, like a door opening onto an entirely different room. He looked at her, really looked, and suddenly the small details he had overlooked seemed glaringly obvious. The subtle design of her clothing, elegant in a way that now felt unmistakably regal. The way people nearby were beginning to watch with cautious curiosity, sensing something significant was happening. You're, he began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Elara met his gaze, and there was apology in her eyes, but also a quiet steadiness. Yes, she said softly. One of the attendants cleared his throat politely, as if aware that interrupting would be unwise but necessary. Your Majesty, the council chamber. I know, she said. For a moment she said nothing more, and the music continued around them, strangely at odds with the sudden shift in Colin's world. Somewhere nearby, a musician struck a bright, cheerful chord, completely unaware that a traitor's understanding of reality had just been rearranged. Colin let out a slow breath. Well, he said at last, that explains why you dance better than I do. Elara blinked, then laughed, a quiet, genuine laugh that seemed to surprise even her attendants. I'm not sure, she said, that royal training includes dancing with reckless traitors. I feel honored to be an exception. The attendants exchanged brief, puzzled glances, clearly uncertain whether this conversation was appropriate, but none of them spoke. I'm sorry, Elara said to Colin, her voice lower now. I did not mean to deceive you. You didn't, he said after a moment. You told me your name. You never said anything that wasn't true. But I did not tell you everything. Colin considered that, then shrugged lightly. Most people don't, the first time they meet someone. For an instant, something in her expression softened, as if his words had lifted a small but heavy weight. I would like, she said, to speak with you again, if you are willing. I think, Colin said slowly, still trying to reconcile the woman he had danced with and the Queen standing before him. I would like that too. The attendants shifted slightly, a silent reminder of obligations waiting elsewhere. Elara inclined her head, a gesture that felt both formal and personal at once. Then we will meet again. She turned to leave, the attendants falling into step beside her. As they moved through the crowd, people stepped aside instinctively, some bowing slightly, others simply staring in quiet astonishment. Colin remained where he was, watching until the blue and silver of their garments disappeared into the upper walkway. The music continued, the dancers moved, and the lanterns drifted overhead as if nothing had changed. Colin exhaled slowly and ran a hand through his hair. Well, he muttered to himself, that's going to be a difficult story to explain to the cargo manifests. Colin slept badly, not because his cabin was uncomfortable. The rented quarters on Leratus were quiet, temperature regulated, and equipped with a mattress that automatically adjusted to relieve pressure points. But because his mind refused to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image. Elara standing beneath the lantern light, smiling as if nothing in the galaxy weighed on her shoulders, and then the attendants arriving, their voices calm and respectful, calling her Your Majesty. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling while the faint vibration of distant docking engines hummed through the station structure. Well done, Colin, he muttered to himself. Next time you go dancing, try not to pick royalty. Start small, maybe a tax inspector. Eventually, exhaustion dragged him into a shallow sleep, but when he woke, the station's artificial morning lights were already brightening the corridors outside. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and for a few seconds the memory of the previous night felt almost unreal, like a vivid dream fading at the edges. Then he noticed the small object resting on the narrow table beside his bed. It was a thin metallic disc, no larger than a coin, engraved with a delicate spiral pattern that shimmered faintly as it caught the light. He frowned, certain it hadn't been there the night before. Colin swung his legs out of bed and picked it up. The surface warmed slightly at his touch, and a soft tone sounded, clear, gentle, unmistakably deliberate. A line of pale blue light traced across the disc, forming words in the air above it. Colin of the trade vessel Maris Finch. If you are willing, I would like to see you today. Garden Dome 7, at the third hour of the afternoon cycle. Elara Colin stared at the message for several seconds. Well, he said quietly, that answers that. He spent the morning inspecting his cargo, though his attention wandered often. Twice he nearly approved a shipment without checking the seals, which was the sort of mistake that could turn a profitable run into an educational disaster. By the third time he caught himself staring blankly at a crate of atmospheric filters, he gave up and sealed the hold early. Hopeless, he told himself, completely hopeless. Garden Dome 7 turned out to be located in one of the quieter sections of the station, far from the crowded promenades. The corridor leading to it was lined with panels displaying shifting images of forests and oceans from different worlds, a gentle attempt to calm travelers unused to living inside metal walls. When the doors slid open, Colin stepped into warm, fragrant air. The dome was vast but peaceful, filled with layered terraces of vegetation. Broad-leafed plants in deep green and silver, slender trees with translucent bark, and drifting clusters of luminous spores that glowed faintly in the filtered sunlight. A narrow stream wound through the center, its water clear and slow, crossed by small arching bridges. And Elara was standing near the water, alone. She wore simpler clothing than the night before, though nothing about her truly looked simple. The cut of the fabric, the quiet elegance of the design, the way she carried herself. It all spoke of a life very different from Colin's own. You came, she said, smiling. I was curious, Colin replied, and also slightly afraid that if I didn't, someone in a blue uniform might appear and drag me here anyway. She laughed softly. I promise I do not send guards to abduct traitors. That's reassuring. I've had enough of being chased by officials. They began to walk slowly along the stream, the soft sound of water filling the pauses between their words. I meant what I said last night, Elara said after a while. I did not wish to deceive you. Those hours, they mattered to me. I believe you, Colin said. Besides, if you'd introduced yourself as a queen, I probably would have spilled my drink and said something embarrassing. You still might. That's true, he admitted. They walked in silence for a few moments, passing beneath the shade of a tall, spiral-trunked tree whose leaves chimed faintly in the circulating air. Is it very difficult, Colin asked at last, being who you are? Elara considered the question. It is not difficult in the way people imagine, she said. I am not burdened every moment. There is beauty in it and purpose. But it is isolating. Every conversation carries weight. Every word is measured. People do not laugh easily around a crown. I laugh easily around almost anything, Colin said. I once laughed during a hull breach alarm. That sounds unwise. It was. Turned out to be a drill, fortunately. The captain was not amused. Elara smiled, and for a while they spoke of smaller things, of travel, of the station, of the strange habits of different species. Colin found himself relaxing again, the tension of the previous night fading into something quieter, more manageable. At one point they crossed a narrow bridge, and Colin paused, looking out over the terraces of plants and the distant curve of the dome. It's strange, he said. Last night you were just you. And now I keep remembering that you're also all of this. I am both, Elara said gently. That is the difficulty. He nodded slowly. I think I understand. A small, round maintenance drone drifted past them at that moment, paused and emitted a cheerful chime before spraying a fine mist over a nearby cluster of flowers. Colin watched it go. I admire that drone, he said. It knows exactly what it's meant to do. Water plants, chime occasionally, never attend council meetings. Elara laughed again, the sound warm and unguarded, and Colin felt a quiet satisfaction at having drawn it from her. They walked for more than an hour, talking easily, the conversation flowing as naturally as it had the night before. Yet beneath it all, Colin remained aware of the strange, delicate balance between them. The memory of that first dance, when neither had known who the other was, and the reality now, where every moment carried new meaning. As they reached the far side of the dome, Elara stopped. I do not know, she said softly. what this can become. My life is not simple, and yours is not tied to any one world. But I would like to continue this. Colin looked at her, at the long ears that marked her as Karathi, at the quiet sincerity in her eyes. I would like that too, he said. Somewhere beyond the dome, the station continued its endless turning, carrying them both through the silent sea of stars. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected. Colin still spent his mornings aboard the Maris Finch, checking cargo manifests and negotiating delivery contracts through the station's trade network, but he found himself watching the clock more often than usual. It was a strange sensation, anticipating something that had nothing to do with profit margins or departure schedules. In the afternoons when her duties allowed, Elara met him in different parts of the station, never with ceremony, never with guards close enough to intrude, though Colin had begun to notice that security was never truly far away. A figure at the end of a corridor, a pair of attendants pretending to study architectural displays, a maintenance worker who stood just a little too still. Elara seemed aware of them, but unconcerned. One afternoon they met in an observation gallery where the outer hull of the station formed a vast transparent arc. Beyond it stretched a nebula, glowing in deep violet and gold, its clouds slowly shifting like tides of light. Colin leaned against the railing, staring outward. I used to think I'd seen every kind of sky there was, he said. Then I started traveling. The universe is very good at proving us wrong, Elara replied. That's true. Last year I landed on a moon where it rained crystals. Nearly broke my helmet. She glanced at him. Nearly? I ran inside. That seems wise. They stood quietly for a while, watching distant cargo ships drift like slow-moving stars. The silence between them had become comfortable, a shared stillness rather than an awkward pause. Do you ever miss it? Elara asked suddenly. Miss what? The anonymity. Walking through a crowd without anyone knowing your name. Colin considered that. I suppose I never thought about it. For me, it's just normal. But if I had to give it up, he shrugged. Yes, I think I would miss it. Elara nodded, her gaze still on the nebula. I remember being a child and sneaking out of the palace kitchens. I would walk through the markets in plain clothes. No one bowed. No one watched their words. They complained about prices and laughed about trivial things. It felt honest. And now? Now honesty is rarer, she said quietly. Colin shifted slightly, leaning his elbows on the railing. Well, he said, for what it's worth, I'm still perfectly willing to complain about prices in your presence. That is very generous of you. I'm serious. I could start right now. Docking fees alone. She laughed softly, and the tension in her voice eased. They began walking along the curved corridor, their footsteps echoing faintly on the polished floor. A service drone rolled past them, humming to itself in a tune that sounded suspiciously like festival music. I think that drone is stuck in a loop, Colin said. It sounds happy. I'd be happy too if my only responsibility was polishing floors and humming. You would grow bored in a week. 3 days, he admitted. Their path eventually brought them to a quieter section of the gallery, where a series of antique spacecraft models were displayed in glass cases. Historic vessels from different civilizations, each carefully restored and labeled. Colin stopped in front of one shaped like a long, slender crescent. This one, he said, is Karathi, isn't it? Yes, Elara said, one of the first ships capable of sustained interstellar travel. It looks fragile. It was, she said. Many did not survive the early voyages. Colin studied the model, imagining the courage or desperation it must have taken to step into such a vessel and vanish into the dark between stars. Every species has stories like that, he said quietly. People who left everything behind to see what was out there. Yes, Elara said, and sometimes they found more than they expected. He glanced at her, sensing the meaning beneath the words, but before he could reply, a faint chime sounded from a discreet communicator at her wrist. She glanced at it briefly, and Colin saw the flicker of duty cross her expression. I have a meeting soon, she said. Diplomatic negotiations. They tend to last longer than anyone predicts. I've noticed, Colin said. Negotiations seem to obey a different clock, one that moves very slowly. They began walking back toward the central lift, neither in a hurry. When they reached it, the doors opened with a soft hiss, revealing an empty car. "I'll see you tomorrow?" Colin asked. "Yes," Elara said, and there was a warmth in her voice that made the simple words feel significant. As the lift doors closed, Colin caught his reflection in the polished metal wall and shook his head slightly. "Well," he murmured to himself, "this is new." The next day they met again, this time in a quieter promenade lined with small shops and cafes. At one table, a group of engineers argued animatedly over a holographic schematic, while a waiter attempted to serve them drinks without being knocked over by gesturing elbows. Colin and Elara sat at a small table near the window, sharing a pot of steaming Karathi tea that tasted faintly of citrus and something Colin could only describe as sunlight. "I could get used to this," he said, taking another sip. "Tea?" "Conversation," he said. Elara smiled, and for a moment the noise of the promenade seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet understanding between them. Yet beneath the warmth, both of them felt it, the unspoken awareness that their worlds were very different, that this fragile, growing connection existed in a space between duty and freedom, between crowns and cargo holds. Neither of them spoke of it. Not yet. Colin began to notice the weight of reality not in a single moment, but in small, quiet ways. It was there in the subtle pauses when Elara's communicator chimed and she silenced it without looking. It was there in the way attendants sometimes appeared at the far end of corridors, never intruding, yet never absent. It was there in the conversations that stopped when she entered certain rooms, only to resume once she had passed. And it was there, most of all, in the looks people gave her, respectful, cautious, carefully measured. One afternoon they walked through a long transit gallery where moving walkways carried travelers in steady streams. The ceiling above displayed a projection of open sky, pale blue with drifting clouds, designed to ease the minds of species uncomfortable with enclosed spaces. Colin glanced upward. "I always find it strange," he said, "how stations try to imitate planets." "Do you prefer the real sky?" Elara asked. "I prefer skies that don't turn off at midnight for maintenance." She smiled faintly. "That did happen once, years ago. Half the delegation thought the sun had exploded." "I would have demanded a refund," Colin said. They stepped off the walkway and continued on foot, moving more slowly than the current of travelers around them. For a while they walked in silence, listening to the distant hum of engines and the murmur of voices. "Elara," Colin said at last, "does it ever bother you?" "What?" "That everyone watches you, that every decision you make echoes farther than you intend." She was quiet for a few steps. "It is simply the shape of my life," she said. "I learned long ago that wishing it different does not change it." "That sounds lonely." "It can be." She glanced at him. "But not always." They turned into a quieter corridor that overlooked one of the station's docking bays. Through the vast observation windows, ships of every design floated in slow, deliberate motion, guided by tractor beams and navigation lights. The Maris Finch was visible among them, small and unremarkable beside larger vessels. Colin folded his arms, leaning against the railing. "That one," he said, nodding toward his ship, "is home. Not a very impressive home, but reliable." "It looks sturdy," Elara said. "That's trader language for held together by optimism and spare parts." She laughed softly. A cargo hauler drifted past the window, its hull covered in faded markings and repair patches. As it rotated slowly, one of its maneuvering thrusters fired with a brief, bright flare. "I used to think I would never leave Kirath," Elara said quietly. "When I was young, the palace felt like the whole universe. And now I know how vast the universe is, and how small a single life can feel within it." Colin glanced at her. "I don't think your life is small." She met his gaze, and for a moment neither of them spoke. A sudden clatter broke the stillness as a maintenance drone rolled past them at high speed, pursued by another identical drone emitting a series of irritated beeps. Colin watched them disappear down the corridor. "I think," he said solemnly, "we just witnessed a domestic dispute." Elara covered her mouth, laughing. "Perhaps one of them forgot to recharge." "A serious offense," Colin agreed. "Unforgivable, really." The laughter faded, leaving behind a gentler quiet. "I will have to leave the station soon," Colin said after a while. The words seemed to linger in the air between them. "I know," Elara said softly. "My contracts won't wait forever, and traders who ignore schedules tend to lose clients." "Yes." They both looked out at the ships again, watching as a freighter disengaged from its docking clamps and drifted slowly into open space. "I don't know what this is," Colin said. "Between us, I only know I don't want it to end like a conversation in a crowded plaza where you turn away and never see the person again." "It will not end that way," Elara said quietly. "Not if I can help it." He turned to her. "Your life is complicated. Mine is mobile. I don't know where those paths meet." "Perhaps," she said, "they do not meet in one place. Perhaps they meet in moments." Colin considered that. "You mean like dancing in the middle of a festival while completely unaware you're dancing with a queen?" "Exactly like that," he smiled. They continued walking, eventually reaching a small balcony that overlooked the inner ring of the station. Far below, the lights of the festival plaza still glowed faintly, though the crowds had thinned in the days since its opening. "I have not danced since that night," Elara said. "Neither have I," Colin replied, "partly because I'm afraid I'll be compared to myself." "That sounds like a difficult standard." "It is. I was very impressive." She laughed again, the sound bright and unguarded, and Colin felt a quiet warmth at having drawn it from her once more. Yet beneath the humor, beneath the easy conversation, both of them felt the approach of something inevitable. The moment when departures would be scheduled, when obligations would reclaim their time, when choices would have to be made. For now, they said nothing about it. For now, they simply stood together, watching the slow, silent motion of ships against the endless black of space. The day of departure arrived quietly, without ceremony. Colin stood in the cargo bay of the Maris Finch, watching as the last container locked into place with a metallic click. The familiar smells of coolant, warm circuitry, and sealed alloys surrounded him, grounding him in the life he had always known. For years this had been enough, the steady rhythm of contracts, routes, and the endless drift between stars. Now, for the first time, the ship felt smaller. He sealed the manifest and leaned against a crate, staring at nothing for a long moment. "Well," he said aloud, "you always wanted your life to be interesting." The ship, as usual, offered no opinion. He left the bay and walked through the station one last time before launch clearance. The corridors felt different now, filled with memories layered over every step. The festival plaza where music still echoed faintly in his mind, the observation gallery where nebula light had painted the floor in violet, the quiet garden dome where conversation had flowed as easily as water. He found himself, almost without thinking, walking toward the plaza again. The festival had ended. The lanterns were gone, the platforms dismantled, the great open space returned to its ordinary purpose. A few travelers crossed the floor, their footsteps echoing softly in the vastness. Colin stood at the center of the empty circle where they had first danced. It looked smaller than he remembered. "I suppose that's how it works," he murmured. "Moments feel enormous while you're inside them." "You are not wrong." He turned. Elara stood a short distance away, dressed simply, without attendants in sight. The quietness of the empty plaza made her presence feel almost unreal, like an echo from another time. "I wasn't sure you would come," she said. "I wasn't sure either," Colin admitted, "but I thought it felt wrong to leave without seeing this place again." They began walking slowly across the open floor, their footsteps soft against the polished surface. "My ship departs in 2 hours," Colin said. "I know." They walked in silence for a while, and Colin found himself noticing small details, the faint pattern in the floor where the dance lights had once glowed, the distant hum of ventilation, the way the station's artificial daylight slanted through high windows. "I have been thinking," Elara said at last, "about what you said, about paths that do not meet in one place. And," he asked, "and I believe I was wrong." He looked at her. "Paths can meet," she continued, "if those who walk them are willing to change their direction, even slightly." Colin exhaled slowly. "That sounds like something a queen would say before proposing something complicated." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps it is." They stopped near the center of the plaza. I cannot leave my world, Elara said quietly. My responsibilities are not something I can set aside, but I can travel more than I once did. I can open my court to new alliances, new routes, new partnerships. Colin tilted his head. You're suggesting... I am suggesting, she said, that a trader who knows the outer routes better than most might find steady work advising a Karathi trade council. Colin blinked. That sounds dangerously close to a real job. You would still travel, she said, but not always alone. He was silent for a moment, absorbing the idea, not as an obligation, but as a possibility. For the first time in years, the future felt less like an endless line and more like a branching path. And what would this advisor do? He asked cautiously. Argue about tariffs, complain about docking fees, tell embarrassing stories at diplomatic dinners. I am highly qualified for all of those tasks. I thought so. They both laughed softly, and the sound echoed faintly in the vast space. Colin looked around the empty plaza again, remembering the music, the lights, the first moment he had turned and seen her standing beside him. I used to think, he said slowly, that the best thing about traveling was that nothing ever tied you down, that you could always leave, always move on. And now? Now I think, he said, that sometimes the best thing is finding a reason not to leave so quickly. Elara met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not the distant composure of a ruler, but the same warmth he had seen that first night when she had simply been a woman asking a stranger to dance. Will you stay? She asked. Colin considered the question carefully, feeling the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a turning point. Yes, he said at last. I think I will. They stood together in the quiet plaza, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Though, Colin added thoughtfully, I should warn you, I am still a terrible dancer. Elara smiled. Then we will have to practice. And in the silence of the empty hall, with no music but the distant hum of the station, they began to dance again. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but with the quiet certainty of two people who had learned, in their own way, how to move forward together among the stars.